Nisambulo Vinaka and Pacific greetings from Fiji. I am Ngande Wanga and happy to be part of this conference and to share two case studies on food marketing and advertising practices in Fiji. And I'd like to acknowledge the support of my colleagues that are listed here on the screen. For the sake of those who are not familiar with Fiji, Fiji lies to the east of Australia, have two major islands with a population of approximately 876,000, of which 57% are indigenous Fijians or the Itoke, and 36% were of Fijians with Indian origin. A bit of introduction. Around 7.2 million children under 5 years in the Western Pacific region are overweight and obese. Children are heavily influenced by the marketing of foods high in saturated fats, trans fatty acids, free sugars or salt. And marketing is pervasive and reaches children through all media platforms and places where they gather, such as schools, supermarkets, at sports clubs, and so on. Children are extremely susceptible to such marketing that influences their food knowledge, their dietary preferences and behaviors, purchase requests, and body weight. And research has indicated that there is a clear link between the food and drink advertisements that children are exposed to and their food choices, cravings, and eating patterns. Increases in childhood obesity are thus a natural response to the persuasive and sophisticated techniques utilized by the corporation on multiple marketing platforms. The coexistence of undernutrition along with the overweight and obesity and diet-related NCD shared the need for creating food environments that support good nutrition, and evidence have also confirmed to us that limited knowledge of healthy diets among the population, inadequate labeling, and the aggressive marketing of unhealthy processed foods have also been recognized as indirect causes of the increase in overweight and obesity. So evidence have also shown that there is limited success globally in the implementation of marketing restrictions to address a double burden of malnutrition, regulation to reduce exposure of children to marketing of unhealthy or to marketing of unhealthy weight to children are also being discussed. So food is a symbol of love, and we love our Pacific traditional cuisines, and I'm sure we all do. We have abundance of fresh foods, fruits, and vegetables sold at reasonable costs throughout our markets in Fiji. However, processed foods are also easily available in small shops and supermarkets, and it's our own individual choice on what to buy. There is significant evidence that marketing can be powerful and persuasive in influencing family decisions about child feeding, as well as children's own decisions and their future brand loyalty. Let's look at the global stage. The populations of Fiji and the broader Pacific Island countries and territories have been significantly impacted by poor nutrition and NCDs. On the global stage, 38 million deaths lost to NCDs each year, out of which 42% were premature, and 82% of these premature deaths occurred in low-middle income countries. The Pacific Island countries have the world's highest prevalence of NCDs, and Fiji is one of the high-burden countries in the Pacific region, where that reported 82% of all deaths in 2010 that are NCD-related, mostly caused by coronary heart disease and stroke, and affected the age group 40 to 59 year age. So strong leadership to achieve a premature mortality target is needed. And Pacific Island countries are also in a position to attempt to meet a poor position to meet the SDGs 2 and 3 relating to food security and reduced NCD mortality. So we will be discussing the background, the problem, and the methodology in this slide. So in the background, restrictions on marketing of unhealthy foods, breast milk substitutes, and food labeling regulations are globally recommended policy initiatives. And globally, there has been limited implementation. But Fiji has advanced a number of initiatives and actions to address the marketing of foods to children with the adoption of World Health Assembly Resolutions 63.14 on marketing of food and non-alcoholic beverages to children. And this includes undertaking consultations and drafting of regulations on the advertising and promotion of unhealthy foods and non-alcoholic beverages to children, establish the policy on food safety by the Central Board of Health, and undertaking a health impact assessment of the draft regulations in 2016. Also, multi-sectoral membership of trade committees that include members from the regulatory food unit based within the health ministry. Fiji has also mandated labeling requirements through the Food Safety Act 2003 that include the need to reflect the sodium content in all processed packaged foods, and local voluntary sodium was set in 2013 in consultation with our local food industry based on a phased education over a period of 4 years, which ended in 2017. So, looking at the problems, the statement of the problem, Fiji is a developing middle-income country which has achieved important economic and social development goals in recent times. Despite efforts, foods and nutrition security remain a concern in Fiji and the Pacific. Fijian households, especially low to medium income, tend to choose cheaper, high-processed foods with poor nutrition value that are available cheaply, which is then the main driver of high rates of NCDs-related morbidity and mortality in the country. Let's discuss the methodology. This study aims to draw lessons from Fiji regarding the challenges and opportunities for policy initiatives that aim to restrict food marketing to children and marketing of breast milk substitutes and food labeling regulations of packaged foods sold in major supermarkets in Fiji. The case studies use research methods as the basis for the study design. We drew on cannot see that properly. We drew on documentary and interview data to construct narrative cases of agenda setting and policy development and change in both case studies. Informed by policy theory, we drew on theories on political economy and priority setting to analyze the data regarding relevant influences on decision making, particularly with respect to power, institutions, ideas, and interest group. Next slide. So the next 3 slides will be discussing the policy or the case studies. And the first case studies we will be looking at marketing efforts to marketing of breast milk substitutes in Fiji. This is an account of the marketing control foods for infants and young children, regulations 2010. Fiji was an early adopter, the International Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes, and the first Pacific Island country to fully implement the code in its laws. The Marketing Controls Foods for Infants and Young Children, Regulations 2010, were introduced to ensure safe and adequate nutrition for infants and young children by promoting and protecting breastfeeding and by regulating the marketing of designated products intended for use by infants and young children. These targets were agreed with the local food industry in 2014. Companies were given a grace period until the end of May 2011 to implement the regulations. But according to our sources, companies did not change their labels to comply with the regulations in a timely way, or companies with the health ministry's directive or comply with the health ministry directive that temporarily labels be applied to formula containers stating breast milk or breastfeeding is best for your baby, and instead recall the products from the shelves when the grace period expired. So Fiji's marketing controls food for infant and young children regulations 2010 were amended in June 2016 to effectively remove all guidelines and restrictions on marketing in the form of labeling in Part 4 of the regulations and replacing them with a much weaker standard on foods for infants and other vulnerable populations, which really do not apply to formula growing up milk. And our third case is on marketing of unhealthy food and alcohol beverages to children. Sorry, our second part of the first case study. In 2004, Fiji became the first Pacific Island country to draft regulations to restrict marketing of food and non-alcoholic beverages to children. The draft advertising and promotion of unhealthy foods and non-alcoholic beverages to children regulations was developed under the Food Safety Act 2003. So the development of the regulation was requested by the then Minister for Health and overseen by the Food Task Technical Advisory Group or FT-TAG. So members of the FT-TAG include representatives of the Ministry of Health, Ministry of Agriculture, and the Ministry of Trade and Finance, as well as representatives from non-government organizations, food industry, and academics. The development process involved drafting of consultant, peer review by Australian experts, consultations with the food industry, and then the draft regulations were sent to the Solicitor General's office for consideration. And our second case study is on the food labeling regulations of packaged foods sold in major supermarkets in Fiji. Fiji has mandated through the Food Safety Act 2004 to display the Nutrition Information Panel for all packaged food products, sodium, for all the packaged food products. And sodium is one of the nutrients required to be reported on the package. In the government's annual 2012 budget, Fiji had placed fiscal measure to promote salt reduction by increasing import fiscal duty on monosodium glutamate or MSG, an increase from 5% to 32%. However, this tax was not limited to the bags of MSG and not on foods that included or were high in MSGs. Fiji adopted voluntary sodium targets in 2013 in selected food categories of food products sold in supermarkets. However, there were no clear mechanisms put in place to monitor compliance. A study that conducted interviews with the different stakeholders and partners from the local food industry indicated that they'd rather do their own. Okay, so in the next two slides, we'll be looking at the results and the discussion. So first, let's look at the restrictions on marketing of unhealthy foods, breast milk substitutes. Across both case studies, strong resistance to marketing regulation by private sector actors were observed, as well as significant constraints to effective multi-sectoral action as the health and economic sectors work at cross purposes to promote their respective priorities. Restrictions on marketing are strongly recommended by global public health nutrition policy, yet as this study clearly shows, they are contrary to prevailing economic policy priorities to foster economic growth through private sector activities. In addition to the marketing, in addition to the marketing, is the regulation response of the government sector with a regulatory remit for restrictions of marketing is the economic sector. Respondents in our study reflected on the effectiveness of concerted effort in achieving soft drink tax in Fiji And yet, our study clearly showed that efforts to restricting marketing were widely seen as contrary to prevailing economic policy priorities to foster economic growth conducive to private sector growth through enabling business to thrive. As a result, some saw marketing restrictions as just unwarranted or simply outside of the realm of the sector responsibility or authority in the face of this tension between economic and public health nutrition goals. Participants identified a critical need for strengthening the participation for civil society actors in policy making in hand for raising public awareness regarding the potential a health benefits of restricting marketing. And the food labeling regulations, increasing reliance on processed food in the Pacific makes nutrient labels and healthier processed foods more important. Foods Task Force Technical Group or FTTAG had formulated the sugar, salt and fat strategy 2013 to 2017, but this has come to a stop because of non-continuous of funding. There is a need to reactivate the FTTAG to discuss or to guide the development and implementation of the sugar, salt and fat strategy. The main findings was that health and economic sectors were working cross purposes to promote their respective priorities. With nutritional composition of the packaged food supply, 40% of eligible products did not meet the proposed voluntary sodium reformulation targets. And that is one of the biggest points that we have found in this study. There is an urgent need to increase clarity on the policy responsibility for regulating nutrition-related marketing, such that proposals for restrictions can be framed within the existing regulatory context. There are some learnings for Fiji. The marketing restrictions span sectoral responsibilities, but because it is a restriction on industry activity, the regulatory remit for the restriction of marketing was seen to lie with the economic sector. In line with this, industry was positioned as a key stakeholder in marketing as a core business activity that should not be regulated, which has tended towards the abandonment of shelving of marketing restrictions. There is an opportunity to increase clarity on policy responsibility for regulating marketing such that the public health merits of proper restrictions are meaningfully considered. And so, lastly, from this slide, developing strategic and inclusive approaches to public health advocacy. And community engagement may help to gain traction for marketing restrictions across relevant government sectors. The results and findings of this research have identified a few more gaps and areas for improvements on how to address monitoring for the sodium in processed foods and ultimately attempts to address the crisis of NCDs in Fiji. The need for periodic monitoring of processed foods is essential. Incorporating a local database similar to the one that we are using from the George Institute for Global Health in Australia, and that would allow for regular monitoring and reliance on research findings. They also need to re-establish the FT tag to provide guidance on not only sodium but for all food-related matters, and this will continually provide evidence to stakeholders for better decision making. The reviewing of sodium for reformulation targets to be on par with global environment, and lastly, you need to explore the feasibility of establishing a front of pack labeling scheme and health star rating for processed foods in Fiji. There are global implications in this study. And this study is in Fiji illustrates the problem, the potential for policy learning across the double burden of malnutrition. And these are still seen as quite separate policy issues. But in this study, we found that many of the politico-economic issues were common. In addition, global recommendations for marketing restrictions as healthy policy intervention would be wise to acknowledge that marketing is a very political issue in the economic sector. The public health nutrition actors also need to be more strategic in their engagement and policy proposals to effectively engage the economic sector in developing restrictions on marketing. This study, this is the list of references that I used in the study, and thank you very much for listening.